Okay, like I said, if y'all have any questions as we're going through this, please, please, please don't hesitate to go ahead and ask me about them. But otherwise, I'm going to try and kind of go through the most important points of the like science, matter, energy module of the course. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to talk about everything that's in those content pages, but I'm going to talk about like the most important kind of stuff, almost like a Cliff Notes review of the unit, if that makes sense. So kind of like, so when you guys go to like review for the AP exam, you know, you could watch the recording and that would kind of give you a good review of this unit, that kind of thing. So basically we've got a few elements that are really, really important to life on Earth. And those elements are hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So we have what we call the carbon cycle. We have a nitrogen cycle. We don't have an oxygen or a hydrogen cycle. We kind of combine those, and we call those the water cycle. We have a phosphorus cycle. And then we have a sulfur cycle. I would say the sulfur cycle is maybe like the least important of the 5 cycles that we really talk about in AP Environmental Science, but they still like to talk about it, so we will. Okay, so one of the things we talk about a lot in environmental science is something called organic versus inorganic. And that's not necessarily like organic food versus inorganic food, but like organic compounds versus inorganic compounds. So organic compounds are usually carbon-based. So a lot of times they'll talk about like organic fertilizers or inorganic fertilizers, and it doesn't necessarily mean like you use organic fertilizers on organic gardens. Organic fertilizers are just fertilizers that are carbon-based, where inorganic fertilizers are not. So, for example, an inorganic fertilizer could be, I want to say they used to spread like iron filings on like as a type of pest control, and then maybe something like DDT could be an organic fertilizer. Okay, so it's not necessarily like organic necessarily means like organic gardening, but it means something that is like carbon based. Okay, and then we'll have to kind of do a little bit of background on energy in order to get ready for these cycles. So we're kind of prepping to talk about these cycles. So energy is just like the ability to move matter, and then we have kinetic energy, which is like the energy of moving, and then we have potential energy and storage, which is like I like to think of it as like non-moving energy, like energy of like being still, like for example, if I'm like laying on the couch, I could go running. I probably have the energy to go running. Am I gonna? Okay, that kind of thing. A lot of people like in physics, they'll talk about like a roller coaster. Like for example, when you're on a roller coaster and you're at the very, very top of the hill and you're getting ready to go down real fast, you have a lot of potential energy at that top of that roller coaster. And once you start moving, that potential energy starts turning into kinetic energy. So that's kind of those types. And then we can talk about chemical energy. Sometimes they'll talk about mechanical energy, things like that. That's just like where you kind of get it. Electrical energy. Kinetic and potential is really the main definition, which if you've had physics or physical science, you've probably learned about those a little bit as well. And then we have our laws of thermodynamics. So this is important when we're talking about the cycling of matter and energy, because that energy is neither gained or lost. So we've always, the planet basically has the same amount of energy all the time. It's just kind of like switching to different forms, right? So, for example, if you put energy into an incandescent light bulb, some of that energy will be released as light, but most of that energy actually gets released as heat. Okay, so but you will have that full amount of energy. It's just maybe not always going to be light. It'll be light and heat or something like that. But it's going to change forms from electrical energy to heat and light. So that's then where we're getting to this first law of thermodynamics. We're switching, right? In our light bulb, our energy is going from electrical energy to heat energy and light energy. Okay, in a flower, they're saying that like sun energy is then basically turned into like the energy basically of keeping this plant alive, or like metabolism, kind of metabolized energy. Okay, so that's just like kind of different energy can change forms. By the way, Nick, if you have any questions, please just type them in the chat box as you think of them, and I'll go ahead and answer them. That way you don't have to wait till the end of the presentation to, if you have a question, so you don't forget it. Okay, so our second law of thermodynamics, this is saying that in any energy conversion, some of this energy is lost. Okay, so we're not going to keep all of it. For example, let's say in a car, right? In a car, you put gasoline in your car and you transfer into it transfers into energy in your car. Some of that energy is lost as friction. Okay, so your engine is not like 100% efficient. You're losing some of that energy as friction. In our bodies, when we're metabolizing things, we lose some of that energy as heat, and that's what makes our bodies warm, right? As we're converting and changing forms of that energy, moving that food energy around, and converting it to what we need in our cells, we're releasing some heat, and that's causing losing basically some of that energy. So then they have this word entropy, which is basically like my favorite science word in the world, and it basically measures the amount of disorder in a system. A system is always going towards more entropy. So for example, when I'm at home and I clean my house, I feel like 30 seconds later it's dirty again, and that is entropy, right? That's entropy. The world is just going towards messiness, and my kids are just kind of helping out, and my husband. So like entropy is saying that it's always going towards more disorder. Okay, it's easier, for example, when you're putting things away, like if you're putting books on a bookshelf, to just throw them on the bookshelf than to put them like very neatly. So that's kind of why the world is going that way, because it's just easier than taking the effort or the energy to make things neat and tidy. It's less energy to make things messy. So then producers, you might have learned this in biology. So this is an interesting thing about environmental sciences. We're kind of combining physics and chemistry and biology all together, and to kind of explain how the world works. Okay, so we talked about a little bit about chemistry. We talked about the elements and the inorganic and organic, and then we did a little bit of physics, and now we've got some biology background knowledge. So producers, they make high energy organic molecules from low energy raw materials. Basically, most of the time, these are plants. Okay, mostly plants, but you do have some like deep sea environments. You've got some like chemosynthetic organisms that can actually take things like sulfur and turn that into some basically food. So they're like they use sulfur instead of sunlight, and then things can eat them. So those environments actually have no bearing on the sun. The sun, doesn't get anywhere near them, and so they have this whole like food web cycle thing going on that has interesting, because they used to not think that you could have an environment without the sun. And then consumers, these are those things that they can't make their own food, and so they have to eat things in order to have food. So this could be animals, fungi, some bacteria, protists. They have to eat something in order to get their food, to get that food for their energy. And so they're called consumers because they have to consume things where the producers can produce things or make their own energy. Okay. I would memorize this equation, this photosynthesis equation. You may have already memorized it back in biology when you took biology, but I would memorize this equation because sometimes they'll ask you for it on the. So that's one of those little like facty things that they kind of almost always ask for somehow on the exam, just kind of like on every released AP exam I've seen, they always have a question that says like, who wrote Silent Spring, or what did Rachel Carson write? And it's just like this question that is always on the exam, and so we always cover it somehow, somewhere. And so this is kind of one of those things. And basically, photosynthesis is what plants do, and they take carbon dioxide and water, and then they use energy from the sun, and they make glucose, which is basically food. It's like sugar food. And they release oxygen and water, and that oxygen again is then what we breathe. And then so it's that cool cycle where we breathe out carbon dioxide and plants take it in, and they release oxygen and we breathe oxygen in. So it's this cool kind of little cycle. And you'll also need to memorize this cell respiration equation, which is on the next slide, and they're basically the opposite of one another. So if you just memorize one and you remember which one that you memorized, you can just swap the other one. So let me show you. Okay, so you see this is basically like the opposite, right? So you can just remember one, and then the other one is basically the exact same thing, just backwards. Okay. And an interesting thing is that a lot of folks think that cell respiration is what animals do, and photosynthesis is what plants do. Well, really, cell respiration, everyone does it. So plants can do this too. Okay. And basically, plants will take their glucose and they'll just kind of put it into this, it'll go into their cells, and then they'll use it for cell respiration. Okay, and this is how living things get energy, is this cell respiration. So a lot of students are under the misconception that this only happens in animals, and it doesn't really help with the picture. But actually, the grass is doing this, and so is the animal. Okay, so they're both doing it. So our cycles, the cycles we're really going to talk about today are the carbon cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the water cycle. And these are the most important ones. And for AP Environmental Science, you should be able to draw, like by the time you take the AP exam, or by the time you take like the unit test, well, I don't want to say like you're not going to be required to draw one of these cycles on the unit test, but you are going to need to know what the different parts are. But by the time you take your AP exam, you should be able to draw like a simplified carbon cycle, like, you know, kind of give some ideas as to what each part of the cycle is. You may not need like every single part, like the one that I'm going to show you is more more detailed than you would need to, you know, be able to write. But you should know the different parts of the carbon cycle and the water cycle and the nitrogen and phosphorus, because they might ask you on the AP exam, and they might not say like, what is this part of the carbon cycle, but they may ask you a broad environmental question, and then you need to use your knowledge of the carbon cycle in order to answer that, like on an FRQ or something. So here's an example of the carbon cycle, and the movement of carbons is measured in gigatons. There's a lot of carbon. Okay, half of this is respired by plants and animals, and half is put in the soil in the form of like detritus. Okay, so we can start anywhere on the carbon cycle and kind of talk about it. So let's say we can talk in the soil. Okay, so in the soil we've got a large amount of carbon. We have things that are decaying and dying. Okay, and then we have things that are already dead. Okay, and this is like a reservoir, which is what they call it a reservoir or a sink, a place where a lot of this carbon is stored. Okay, now where we run into problems is to burn fossil fuels, we go and dig out this oil right here, this carbon that's been stored in the under the earth for millions of years. Okay, so when we get this out, we're releasing carbon that was already kind of stored away into this what they call a sink. Okay, so this carbon was kind of out of the carbon cycle, you know, like it was on the bench, you know, it wasn't part of the game. Okay, and then we're kind of adding it to the game. So we're changing the number of players, we're changing the game a little bit. Okay, so when we get out these fossil fuels, we're releasing carbon that was burned, that was a long time ago, that wasn't active recently. Okay, so we're taking this and kind of adding it to the cycle. Okay, this is kind of a question on your FRQ this week, right? They talk about the carbon. And what's the difference, like, say, burning biofuels, which were growing more recently, to burning fossil fuels? And the biofuels were already kind of in the carbon cycle. We already kind of taken account of them. And then fossil fuels were like adding these to the cycle. So we're kind of, you know, we've got more than we anticipated. Okay, then we burning. Okay, so anything that burns is going to release carbon. Okay, if you grill, okay, my husband likes to grill outside. That's going to release carbon into the atmosphere. Driving, cutting down tree or burning trees, like from deforestation. Any power plants that are going to burn fossil fuels. Okay, all of those things are going to release carbon into the atmosphere. And usually it's in the form of carbon dioxide, which is our most well-known greenhouse gas. Okay, and this carbon can actually intensify the greenhouse effect, which we'll get to later. Okay, some of this carbon is used to form limestone. Limestone is calcium carbonate, and so it's, you know, got carbon in it. And then some of that carbon is released with weathering. Okay, like wind and rain and things like that will kind of wear away mountains and rocks and things like that, and that'll release that carbon back into the cycle. Photosynthesis is going to play a part, right? Because we just talked about how we release carbon dioxide when we breathe, and plants take it in. So that's kind of like a little mini carbon cycle. Okay, when things decompose, and then decomposers are like kind of doing the decomposing, like bacteria and stuff, they can release carbon back into the atmosphere. The atmosphere is a sink of carbon, so it can store a certain amount of carbon. The problem is with all this burning of fossil fuels, we're adding more carbon than we really should into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere can't handle that. It's not a large enough sink. And so then what happens is sometimes that carbon gets deposited in the ocean. And the ocean is also a really excellent sink of carbon, but again, it can't handle all the excess carbon that's coming from the atmosphere, so that can cause ocean acidification. Because they take the carbon in the atmosphere, mixes with the water, and it creates hydrochloric acid, not hydrochloric acid, but an acid. And so that causes the pH of the ocean to go down, which then can have some problems for sea life, because they really like a 7.2, 7.4 kind of pH. They prefer to be a little more neutral. So that's like kind of an overview of the carbon cycle. So you should be able to kind of, you know, the big parts of it. You may not need like all the little tiny pieces, but you should know like the basic gist of the cycle. Okay. So this is kind of already going over what I already talked to you about, so I'm going to kind of fast forward this. So these are how this slide is kind of talking about how humans are changing the carbon cycle. Okay, so one of the problems is that we are removing or changing up to 40% of the photosynthetic effort, right? So remember, plants and trees, right? They can absorb CO2, right? That's kind of like what they breathe, CO2, right? Well, if you cut down the trees, not only does cutting down trees usually release carbon into the atmosphere because they usually burn them when they do deforestation, but then there's also nothing to breathe in that carbon dioxide, so then you've got even more carbon in the atmosphere. They call that a positive feedback loop because it keeps making it worse, right? And then, in addition, this is what I was talking about, how the fossil fuels are kind of increasing the amount of carbon put into that cycle. We're by burning fossil fuels and burning trees for deforestation and things like that, we are increasing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So these are two really, really big problems that we are causing in the carbon cycle. Okay. Now here's the phosphorus cycle. The cool thing about the phosphorus cycle, if you notice, there is no atmospheric component. And this is the only cycle, in fact, that okay, that was weird. Can y'all hear me now? Okay, that was weird. It like marked me busy or something for a second. It was like reverberating. So there's no atmospheric component in this cycle. It is totally land and water based. Okay, so that's huge. This is one cycle that it doesn't, and all the others do. So that's kind of interesting. I went ahead and put phosphate here for you, just in case you needed help with that. I tend to forget the chemical name for phosphate. If you're writing an FRQ or something, you can just write phosphate. They don't require you to like show the PO43 minus, but just so you kind of know if you see that on a diagram or something. Okay, here too, lots of places. So anyway, the big problem with the phosphorus cycle. Okay, so a lot of phosphorus is stored in rocks. Okay, and then what happens is we can mine it. We mine the phosphate rock in order to make fertilizer. Okay, and this is the big part with phosphorus. This is why we care so much about the phosphorus cycle, is because of fertilizer. A lot of environments are limiting in phosphorus. They don't. That's what production is limited by. So, for example, if you add phosphorus to a lawn, your lawn is going to get greener. It's going to grow thicker because phosphorus is limiting in that environment. Same with most agricultural fields. So anything that they're growing like corn or something like that, they will add phosphorus as a fertilizer, and that will allow them to grow more on the same amount of land because that land was limiting in phosphorus. Okay. Same thing happens in the water. The water is limiting in phosphorus. And so if you add phosphorus to the water, you're going to get an overgrowth in algae and phytoplankton, okay, which can then, there's a lot of things that this can do. It can shade out, usually these are plants, like floating plants. So if like this is, say we have like seaweed growing here, if we have this algae or corals, if we have this algae growing here, sometimes these algae can shade out that grows extra with the phytoplankton or with the phosphorus. It will kind of shade those plants below and cause them to die. It will also, they will like do this like boom and bust kind of thing. So they'll grow this huge amount of algae when they get this phosphorus, and then the population reproduces so fast that it grows exponentially, and there's not enough phosphorus to support that population, so then it dies. And then all of those dead algae then sink to the bottom, and then they start decomposing. And decomposers use up oxygen, so then they take up all the oxygen in the water, and then there's not enough oxygen for things like fish and other animals in the water, and then you get these like giant they call them dead zones, and that's like off the coast, off of in the Gulf of Mexico by where the Mississippi River lets out. There's a giant dead zone there because the Mississippi dumps like a bunch of phosphorus water into the Gulf of Mexico, and the phosphorus water oftentimes comes from the fertilizer. Okay, so phosphorus is necessary, right? Because we need it in our cells. If you remember, like biology, ATP, right? There's the phosphate backbone in your DNA. You do need some, but what happens is they put a whole bunch of fertilizer in the yards and the lawns and places like that, and then it runs off into the water and it creates this huge problem. Okay, so that's the big problem with the phosphorus cycle. We've got this part over here that I didn't really, well, I did go through the algae, but we didn't go too much into the part with the plants and stuff, because the big part that we discussed in environmental science is this phosphorus runoff from fertilizer. And then that process I was telling you about that causes the dead zone is called eutrophication. And if you want to be really specific, you can call it cultural. But I used to work in a lab where they really studied that, and they just call it eutrophication. They didn't bother with the cultural part. Okay, so here's the human impacts of the phosphorus cycle. How are we screwing up this cycle, or how are we changing it? And basically, it's because we're using these fertilizers. When this phosphorus runs into the aquatic ecosystems, there's really no way to get it out. You can't put it back into the soil, okay? When water evaporates, right, just the water evaporates, not anything in it. And so, it won't go back in rain. It's just stuck in the water, okay? And then it causes this basically eutrophic process. And we're going to get more. This is when I talk face to face. We're going to get more into this process of eutrophication. We'll talk about it in like the water pollution unit. But right now, you guys should just kind of know that it's an important part of the phosphorus cycle and the nitrogen cycle, but we haven't gotten there yet. So here's our nitrogen cycle. Okay, the main reservoir of nitrogen is the air, right? So we knew with carbon, right, we stored a lot of it in the soil, and then in the phosphorus cycle, almost all of it was in the soil, right, because it has no air component or atmospheric component. But then in the nitrogen cycle, most of it is in the air. If you remember, right, the atmosphere is like 78, 79% nitrogen. Okay. And so, and this nitrogen into is non-reactive. It doesn't really bond very well. It's just kind of there. So basically in the nitrogen cycle, the big part of it is these nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and then again, fossil fuel combustion, fertilizers, and things like that. So I'll explain a couple parts. So manure and compost, this animal waste has a lot of nitrogen in it. So for example, if you have a farm or a one of those big feeding operations and it's near a waterway, the animal waste can get into the waterway and it can add nitrogen to the waterway, which will then increase that whole eutrophication aspect that we had talked about. A lot of times folks put fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer. Usually the fertilizer is like N and P, so it'll have nitrogen and phosphorus. They'll put that fertilizer on their crops, and then again, it can run into waterways. When you burn fossil fuels, a lot of times you're going to release some nitrogen into the air, and this can form, they call them NOx pollutants because there's a few different numbers that can go down there and cause trouble. They can create like acids and things like that. You can actually have some nitrogen fixation with lightning, which is kind of cool. But a lot of it is these cyanobacteria, or these bacteria that kind of fix nitrogen or change the format of the nitrogen. Okay, and so that's kind of the nitrogen cycle a little bit. Is the big parts again that we'll talk about in environmental science. There's this whole like fertilizer aspect, the manure aspect, and then the pollution in the atmosphere. Onward. Okay, so how are we screwing this up, right? How are we changing the nitrogen cycle? Again, the big part is this agricultural, fertilizer, and fossil fuel combustion. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier. They will accelerate the nitrogen cycle, so make it go much faster, and then they'll produce nitric acid. Okay, so when you burn fossil fuels, you produce that NOx, and then it basically reacts with like water in the atmosphere, and it produces nitric acid. Okay, then this nitric acid is in the air, and it comes down in the form of acid rain. Okay, and then you have this thing called a nitrogen cascade. So there's these huge so we may do something little like add fertilizer, and then we have this like kind of cascade of effects. This affects it's just like one thing happens to the next and the next and the next, and that's called a nitrogen cascade. And these are these complex effects that cause like something very tiny that we've done to the nitrogen cycle that maybe we didn't realize. It has more far-reaching effects than we expected. So if we want to kind of compare these cycles, we'll get to water in a second. You'll see that the major source for carbon is air, phosphorus is rock, and nitrogen is soil. The biggest reservoir for nitrogen, though, is the air. So this is, it's an okay table. I'm not really thrilled with it, but it's the best I could find. And then this really, it shows the human impact, and then it's almost like a fun fact, right? So carbon's taken in by plant leaves. There's no atmospheric component, and bacteria are kind of like in charge of the nitrogen cycle. Okay, so here's our water cycle. The water cycle, you guys probably know the basics of, right? We'll have water in a water body, either the ocean or a lake or something. It can evaporate, right? And just the water leaves, so the salts stay in the water. And then it can condense into clouds. It can condense into clouds. And then it can rain, precipitate, right? And then when it precipitates, it infiltrates or percolates. That's kind of like just soaking into the soil. And then it can be reabsorbed by plants. It can go into the water, and then it can go back into like a spring or something like that. And it can also come from runoff. Now, some important parts. The runoff. Anything, as this water is running to the body of water, the runoff. Anything that's here. So if you have nitrogen, a fertilizer, or if you've got some sort of animal operation and you've got like animal, I don't know, this is supposed to be a poop. If you have like animal poop or waste or something like that, that's going to go with that water to the body of water. So it's really important, to be careful with what you're putting on your lawns or what you allow to run off. A lot of times you might see, I went to the University of Florida, and they would have all the drains said like this drain drains to Lake Alice, which is a big lake on campus. And so you kind of were like, maybe I shouldn't dump that or whatever. Same thing with infiltration and percolation. If you build a city here, right, with tall buildings and concrete, it's not going to infiltrate very well because you've got the city here in this concrete, and you've gotten rid of the grass. Okay, so then that water table, instead, a lot of times it either evaporates because it's so hot in the city, or it runs off somewhere. And when it runs off, it's taking any pollutants, that are on the ground in that city. If it can't absorb back into the soil, then this groundwater or the water table, it can't be recharged, or you can't add to it. So, for example, when we drink, a lot of times we take water out of this water table and we use it to drink. And then ideally, it would get recharged, or we would kind of fill it back up with water that has percolated down from rain and things like that. But if we build a city or something, we don't, that water can't get back down to the water table. So then the water table starts going down and down and down, and we run out of water. Okay, there are places in Florida where the water table used to be higher, and the ground in Florida looks like Swiss cheese, and so it's limestone. So there's like all these like holes all over the place, and when the water table is here, that's okay because all these holes are filled with water. But then when the water table gets down here, now these holes are filled with air, and they're not as sturdy. So then you can build a house on that land, and then if there's the land is not super stable, then you can form like basically like a sinkhole. My sister's house, they had an issue with one of these last hurricanes where they had a sinkhole develop at their house, and they actually had to get all these concrete pylons and things like dug into the ground. It was more work than their house was worth, actually, that the insurance company did in order to stabilize her house so a larger sinkhole wouldn't appear and basically have her whole house fall into it. And when they were looking at her house, they actually they kind of surveyed the whole neighborhood, and they said there were a lot of houses in that neighborhood that were basically sitting on sinkholes, and it was just a matter of time before they sunk as well, or a sinkhole developed on their land. So that was kind of scary for them. So there's a few loops in the hydrological cycle. So we have this evapotranspiration loop. This is when water. This is probably like the main one that you know of, where you have water evaporating and then return as precipitation. Then we have this surface runoff loop, where the water runs off and becomes part of the surface water system. And then this groundwater loop, where the water moves down into the groundwater through the aquifer, exits to a spring, and then kind of joins with that evapotranspiration loop to evaporate, and then come down as precipitation, and then percolate back into the soil. Okay, so we've got like, it's one big loop, and then we've got these kind of like little minor loops in between. So this is just like kind of some background knowledge. Evaporation is when water changes from a gas to a liquid, a liquid to a gas. Water vapor is going to be really important because we'll get to this in the atmosphere unit, but it's greenhouse gas. You don't really think about it because you think like water is good and stuff, but water can be a greenhouse gas actually. So how are we changing the water cycle? We can change the Earth's surface, which is going to affect the water cycle. We can change the climate. We can pollute, right, which will change the water cycle, because instead of like nice pretty rain, we'll have like acid rain. And then when we're taking this water out for human use, we talked about how that can affect the aquifer and the water table. Okay, so how's climate change going to affect the water cycle? If you have a warmer climate, you're going to have more evaporation. Okay. Global warming or global climate change is believed to be speeding up the hydrologic cycle, so it's going a little faster. We've experienced more rain recently in the past 50 years than we have before. And then the warmer climate is likely going to generate more hurricanes and more droughts. So a lot of folks think that it's going to be wet all over, or it's going to be dry all over. But some places are going to get wetter and some places will get drier. So it's kind of like, it's a little bit of that that can neither be created nor destroyed, but we are actually releasing um, glaciers and things like that. So that's kind of how the big parts of how we're affecting the water cycle. So hopefully this was helpful to you. That's all I have for y'all tonight. If you have questions, please let me know. I would love to answer them for you. But otherwise, you guys are free to go. That's all I have for you.